So just to get started, how did you end up with Space Force?
Yeah, so well, I'll just start by a quick caveat that our public affairs folks make us say
Okay.
before any
Okay.
interview, just that these are the opinions I express are my own and don't necessarily represent the Space Force or the Department of Defense. But
Okay.
with that, I think your question, how did I get in the Space Force? Is that the
Yeah.
question?
Yeah, so I guess you graduate with your undergraduate. Did you know at that time that you were interested in a military career?
Yeah, so when I was in high school, I was looking for ways to pay for undergrad. And so I think I was like a sophomore or junior in high school and started looking for different ways and um, looked into the service academies like the Air Force Academy and West Point and those types of places, and also ROTC programs at normal universities, I'll call them. And
Yeah.
I went for, I think it was my junior year high school. I went for a ROTC interview and was lucky enough to get a scholarship. And I'm from Iowa.
Okay.
Uh, so my regional like ROTC interview was at the University of Iowa, and they gave me a scholarship on the spot. And so I kind of had a decision to make if I was going to take that or take my chances of getting an interview at like a national board, and decided to just take the interview or take the scholarship to the University of Iowa. So I went to the University of Iowa for mechanical engineering and on an ROTC scholarship. So all 4 years of undergrad, I was in ROTC, and then commissioned the day I graduated from the University of Iowa. I commissioned into the Air Force as an um, developmental engineer. That's the career field. So I was a
Yeah.
mechanical engineer for the Air Force, and then I spent the next 8 or 9 years as a essentially an aerospace engineer for the Air Force, mostly working on like fighter jets
Oh,
um,
nice. That's
and
fun.
turbine engine research and development and things like that. And then had an opportunity to apply once the Space Force stood up in 2019. They sent out a call to all officers across all the services asking for folks who were interested in transferring to the Space Force. And I threw my hat in the ring and was selected to come over to the Space Force. So
Oh,
that was
that's cool.
2020 or 2021. Time evades me, but
Yeah.
it's been 3 or 4 years. I was part of the like inaugural uh, first set of officers that transitioned from the other services into the Space Force.
Wow. So building the rocket ship while flying it kind of thing.
Yeah, very much so. So, I mean, the Space Force, I don't know how familiar folks are with the stand-up of the sixth branch of the military, the Space Force, but um, it was signed into law, I think December 20th, 2019, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2019. And they started off with a very small headquarters staff of just like a couple dozen. And they
Wow.
were charged by the president to stand up this new thing, the Space Force, and figure that out. So
Wow.
it went very quickly from like one person, General John Raymond at the time, to what it is now, which is I want to say like 9 or 10,000 people, which is still very small when you
Hmm.
consider the size of the other military services. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's we're still figuring it out. I mean, we're year four into the Space Force and still very much like trying to figure out our what we do, who we are, what our culture is, like, the type of people that we're trying to bring in and develop. And it's exciting. There's
So do you feel like, okay, so you were an '01 coming out of college, and
Yep.
then by 2019, I'm not trying to age you, but by 2019, '02 at that point, had
No,
you still pretty
I
early
was a
on?
captain. I was a captain when I transitioned to the Space Force
Okay.
in 2020. I'm a major now.
Okay.
I'll be up for lieutenant colonel in a couple years, few
Wow,
years.
congratulations.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Okay, so when you went over to Space Force then, you your mechanical engineering background supported your role with Space Force, or did you have to pick a specific role, or were you coming in to advise?
No, so well, actually, so I had an undergrad in mechanical engineering, but then my through my first 8 or 9 years in the Air Force, I got a master's in business administration, an MBA, and then I
Okay.
also got a master's in aerospace engineering
Okay.
with a focus in material science. And
Hmm.
my specific focus area was ultra high temperature ceramics, which is like the tiles on the space shuttle
Hmm.
that you know help the space shuttle come back into through the atmosphere.
Yeah.
I was studying new materials that would be reusable, so you wouldn't have to like replace or repair like those types of materials on a vehicle like the space shuttle. Anyway, so
I mean, that's a big job though, because you look at what SpaceX is doing with the reusable boosters.
yeah,
I mean, everything is reusable. That helps us be more efficient in space exploration. So I mean, that's a huge field to be a part of and
yeah,
successful right now, right?
yeah. I mean that material science. I mean is obviously a huge field. There's so many different fields and expertise that the Space Force is looking for today.
Hmm.
Um, from, astronautical engineering, basically any engineering field, take your pick of any STEM field, really, physics,
Yeah.
engineering, chemistry, material science, um, and then, cybersecurity, IT, data analytics, like, all the buzzwords that you guys
Right.
probably hear in academia too are all like the Space Force and space in general is enabled through high technology. So any space related field, but I'm also I now moving on. I'm going to be kind of a program manager of sorts, and so we need people who are business savvy, financially savvy, um, you know, building, establishing contracts, looking at finances,
Yeah.
those types of things. We also need, I mean, really, we need expertise in a myriad of fields, and um,
Because then you've got your logistics. So, like, my husband focused on the supply chain on a ship,
yep,
and it
yep,
covered so many different things, but it was primarily business. And then it was a little bit of like juggling and then making sure everything lands at the same time or at the right
yeah,
time. So,
yep.
so as Space Force is growing, then the variety of fields expand too.
Yeah, exactly. And the commercial space sector is really pacing the United States right now in terms of
Yeah.
like space research and development, space development in general. Um, Commercial space is booming, and so we need savvy experts on both the private industry side and on the government side that can speak the same language and make sure that the United States government is entering into agreements and contracts that um, so that we get what we're paying for
Yeah.
and we can understand like the types of capabilities that we're buying from the commercial sector.
So that actually leads into one of my slightly technical questions for you. Does Space Force play a role in managing or regulating satellite assets? So you said privatization of, so like SpaceX, they get contracted to send satellites up into orbit. So is Space Force, I guess I know there's a lot of confidentiality, but are you guys in the loop on every single thing that's orbiting?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I just came from I was the we call it the flight commander, but I was like the lead Space Force rep at Cape Canaveral, Florida, managing space launch from the Cape with SpaceX. So
Oh wow.
all SpaceX
That's
launches
so
at the
cool.
Cape. So I was managing a team of like 50 engineers and program managers and technicians that were basically working with SpaceX to provide the services that they need, but also monitoring their activities on the Cape.
Hmm.
Long story short, yeah, the Space Force and U.S. Space Command, which I can talk about the difference between those two organizations, are heavily involved in managing and regulating the space domain. So the job of the Space Force is to protect U.S. interests in from we say in from and to space, and that includes all U.S. satellites in orbit around the world. U.S. Space Command. So Space Force, we say organizes, trains, and equips the forces, the personnel that execute the mission day to day. But the Space Force doesn't execute the mission per
Hmm.
se. U.S. Space Command, which is what's called a combatant command, executes operations in space on behalf of the United States. So the Space Force gets folks ready and trained and equipped and provide and buys all the stuff basically for people to do their job. And then U.S. Space Command executes the mission. And almost all the people that work for U.S. Space Command are Space Force Guardians, but they are two distinct like entities.
Yeah,
So
is that like the government's way of saying we are not the rocket scientists, but the US Space Command is, because that's not a military branch. That's
they are military. So U.S.
oh,
Space
okay.
Command is Department of Defense. Yeah, and it's really not to get too complicated into like organizational structure, but the globe essentially is divvied up into different regional, what we call combatant commands. So Africa has like a four-star general, U.S. AFRICOM, who runs all operations in Africa. European Command, Indo-PACOM has like its own four-star commander managing all those activities. And the
Okay.
United States Air Force, let's say, if people are more familiar with the Air Force provides jets and personnel to those combatant commanders all over the world, to execute the missions in those regions. And space now is just another, you can think of it as another region where we execute operations. And
Yeah.
Space Force provides the personnel and equipment and everything else for Space Command to execute those operations in space.
Wow.
But
Okay,
to
that
get
makes
back to
more
your
sense.
original question, U.S. Space Command, um, one of their missions is to monitor all space debris, all orbital space assets in space, not just U.S. assets, but all assets. I
Hmm.
think everything smaller than 10 centimeters in diameter is actively tracked. We call it space domain awareness or space situational awareness, by United States Space Command. And US Space Command provides that service for free to the entire world. And if Space Command becomes aware of a potential collision in space between two objects, whether they're active satellites that can maneuver, or
Hmm.
if it's just a if it's just a discarded piece of a rocket that can't control itself anymore, which whichever it is, U.S. Space Command makes the owners or operators of those assets aware that there's an impending collision so that they can take action to avoid creating additional debris fields. So that's just
Wow.
one example of how the U.S. monitors um, the space to uh, maintain safety, environmental safety, and to prevent additional debris generation. But we also have a very active role in certifying launches from space or from the United States specifically, to ensure that the way in which those launches are executed and the way satellites are inserted into orbit, uh,
Hmm.
ensure with it, that we execute those missions with the least amount of risk possible, so that we do maintain access to the space domain and to prevent collisions in space and debris generation and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and to try to avoid upsetting someone else's project.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's really interesting. And we talk about career fields or capabilities that the United States Space Force is looking for. We also need a lot of expertise in law, and
Hmm.
international law and space law is like a very interesting, complex field that we need a lot of expertise in, because there's a lack of international space law right now that really prohibits us from acting in certain ways in space, or from, you know, like negotiating with other partners around the world in the way in which we operate in from into space. So, um,
It's kind of like in The Martian when he says it's maritime law.
yeah,
So,
yeah, there's a lot of parallels between, law of the seas and laws in space, but then, yeah, it
it's
gets very
probably going to
complicated.
change, right? That's got to change
Yeah,
quite a bit.
yeah, well, of course, every um, international actor in space has a vested interest in trying to change international policy and regulations and establishing norms of behavior in space that benefit them. So the
Mm-hmm.
United States is trying to project our worldview onto the international community for
Mm-hmm.
space regulation and space policy. And China and Russia and the European Space Agency and India are all trying to do the same thing. So it's this big, I mean, it's it's politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's diplomacy and bureaucracy fighting and negotiating for how it's going to be.
So,
And
one of
it,
the things we've talked about is how collaborative space exploration became following the space race.
mhm.
Now we see international groups flying together, hanging out at the International Space Station together. Do you feel like collaboration is improving still, or do you feel like with the privatization that's happened recently, there's a little more competition?
Well, privatization, it's interesting. I don't know if you guys were tracking, but the Department of Defense and the United States Space Force just released within the last month or two their strategy for integrating commercial space with national security space. And
Okay.
so there's some documents out there that are really interesting, really complex strategies on how the DoD and the Space Force intend to partner with private industry to um, pursue greater national space power for the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but if you read the national security strategy and the national space strategy, it talks extensively about how important um, partnerships and allies are for the United States in the space domain.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just the nature of space, and you are in your class are probably more familiar with this than the average person, but the nature of space necessitates international cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
There is no territorial sovereignty in space. Space, you know, orbital mechanics is inherently global, and so um, individual space actors or operators of satellites can't just act unilaterally um, without impacting other actors in space. And so it necessitates this cooperation. And a failure to cooperate can result in space disasters
Mm-hmm.
that could pollute the domain forever, essentially. And
Yeah.
so I think you do see a recognition of that, even by China and Russia, which is why I think the space domain, um, there is more potential there for international cooperation, even through strategic competition,
Mm-hmm.
than in other domains, because of kind of this mutually vulnerable domain that everybody wants to maintain access to.
Do you feel
Um,
like information is shared collaboratively? So if for example, the Artemis mission, that's a United States specific mission,
yep.
right? Okay, so there's not another group in the world that's trying to accomplish the same thing, and instead they're contributing or just watching to see, what Artemis can achieve before they try something. You know what I mean? Like, is like you wouldn't withhold information for a global effort like space exploration, right? That's
So
probably a really loaded question.
so the Artemis Accords, the United States' policy for the Artemis Accords is to get as much international cooperation as possible. So we are
Awesome.
encouraging international cooperation through the Artemis Accords. However, and I might be wrong on this, so don't hold me to it, but
Okay.
I believe I know that there are some domestic laws in the United States that prohibits collaboration with uh, China on certain technology sets that overlap with the Artemis Accord. So it's essentially very difficult to collaborate with China specifically on Artemis,
Okay.
or or in a lot of space uh, programs. But China specifically is pursuing an Artemis type collaboration project in space on multiple fronts, like their um, their Chinese space station. They've just signed new agreements with several other countries to bring other nations astronauts to their space station to collaborate on things. So yeah, there is kind of this US led order through Artemis Accords. And then there's kind of this Chinese side attempt to, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily like nefarious or anything, but
Right.
they want to work with other nations too and increase
Okay.
their influence in the space domain and be seen as a leader in space. And so you kind of do have these sides, not necessarily pitted against each other, but competing.
Okay. So like 2026, 2027 rolls around, we get somebody back to the moon. They get there and they look across the yard and they're like, "Oh, hey, you're here too." So that's possible that you've got
Yeah,
multiple people going.
there's 100% a new space race going on.
That's kind of
And
exciting though. That's kind of exciting that we get to maybe see that again
yeah,
with
and
new
quite
technology.
frankly, the space race, the new space race, is really what precipitated the stand up of the Space Force.
Okay.
So, I mean, a space force or a space corps has been advocated for decades. It wasn't just something that popped up recently, but like the maritime domain or the air domain or the land domain, um, space has become a contested domain. So just like all the others, there's a race for influence and power and resources in the space domain, and the U.S. has strategic national interests in space, and well, for the past several decades, we've enjoyed kind of an asymmetric advantage in space, and by what I mean by that is that we had more space power, more space
Mhm.
assets, more space capability than any other nation on Earth. But within the past 20 years, specifically, China has caught up to us quite a bit.
Okay.
And some of the activities we see from China in space concerns the United States, and they threaten to put our capabilities in space at risk. And
Uh,
so the Space Force has stood up to protect and defend our space assets.
okay.
Uh,
So here's kind of a question from left field then. So I know that the Navy and the Coast Guard, they're looking for submarines that maybe aren't where they're supposed to be, or maybe the Air Force is looking out for interesting weather balloons that make their way across like a couple years ago.
yep.
So if you as Space Force notice that there might be a potential conflict in space, do you, apart from asking owners to manipulate their satellites differently, or for China if they're doing similar tests like the Artemis mission will be, do you have the ability to defend physically, or is it more of just hey, we're watching this, we know what you're getting ready to do, we are aware of your intentions here? What does that defense look like whenever it's in space? Because it's not like you can send a jet up real quick.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And there's only some things I can talk about
That's okay. That's
openly.
okay.
Um,
Maybe, or maybe
so
that's
we
a let's wait and see if we need to talk about that at a
No,
later date.
so for sure, the Space Force is working on capabilities to defend U.S. assets in space.
Okay, that's awesome.
And we are, the space domain awareness mission I talked about earlier is
Yeah.
really essential to ensure that we are aware of what China's or any other nation's capabilities are in space to understand if they are putting our assets at risk. So yeah, we don't rely on any other nation to tell us what their capabilities are in space or what um, yeah, they're capable of doing. Of course, we don't fully always understand their intent, but
Okay.
that's the job of the intelligence community
Yeah.
is like
Yeah.
work to try to figure that out. But the United States Space Command and the United States Space Force are actively working projects and capabilities to defend U.S. assets in space.
Okay. And I guess one nice thing about space exploration is once something's out there, it's not hidden anymore. There's not a lot of hiding.
Yeah, and there's a lot of really interesting conversations happening about historically operations in the space domain have been like top secret, right? And
Hmm.
we can't talk about them.
Hmm.
But there's been a move um, recently to try to declassify things so that legislators, and the American people, and people and actors around the world understand, potential nefarious actions that are going on in space by other countries, um, to help raise the awareness level and to help
Hmm.
people understand like space is a contested domain. That's why we're standing up Space Force. That's why the U.S. Space Command mission is so essential. The rest of the joint force, as we call it, the Air Force, Marines, Army, Navy, and the U.S. Day-to-day life, um, is so reliant on space today in a way that a lot of other nations aren't. It, we're more reliant on space in the United States than any other nation on Earth. And
Because
so,
for someone who might not be fully aware, because the satellites we have in orbit are a primary resource for communication.
yeah, so there's a lot of capabilities that DoD satellites specifically provide.
Hmm.
MilSatcom, or military satellite communications, is one of them.
Hmm.
Uh, but the Space Force owns and operates the GPS satellite,
Okay.
provides that service for free to the entire world.
Thank you.
Um, so that's position, navigation, and timing.
Yeah.
So it's all the apps that we use that rely on our location, all the websites. The U.S. energy grid is tied to the position, navigation, and timing signal that GPS satellites provide to make sure that we don't have like blackouts in our energy grid, and regulates
Yeah.
our economy is tied very tightly. Like the way that we trade and things like that is tied very
Hmm.
tightly to the timing signals that are provided by GPS. The Space Force, actually, I think they have a website that you can go on and see like what would happen, like what would a day without space look like, and it really kind of helps you understand how reliant we are. So satcom, satellite communications, GPS, weather satellites, um, intelligence satellites, or satellites that take imagery of the Earth, to help us respond to national or natural disasters,
Hmm.
disaster recovery, humanitarian relief. Um, we've got missile warning satellites. That's a specific DoD asset. So anytime anyone around the world launches a missile, like an intercontinental ballistic missile, it puts off a very unique signature, and our satellite constellation in space picks up that signal and relays that information directly to our combatant commanders and the president and everybody,
Yeah.
so that we can defend ourselves against potential adversaries.
So you
Um,
just answered a huge open-ended question that I ask every class every semester, which is there was a lot of arguments. There are still arguments about why fund space exploration, why fund um, NASA, or why is SpaceX something that should be paid attention to, because everybody says, we need to spend more trying to fix what we've got going on here. And I think it's a little bit of like a siloed perspective, because you just said we can't fix anything here unless we've got some awareness and some communication, some protection. So I'm excited to look at this "What Would a Day Without Space" website look like. I haven't heard of that before, because I think that answers the question for us. We don't
yeah,
really
I mean,
understand
there's
how important it is.
there's so many reasons to invest in space. And I hear the argument, I understand the perspective of we've got a lot to fix at home. Um, but every dollar invested in space has been returned, 100-fold to the U.S.
Hmm.
economy.
Yeah.
And NASA has a list of all the technologies and patents that have been granted based on the science that was executed in support of the Apollo mission. And it's not just things like Tang and orange drink and stuff
Right.
like that, or memory foam mattresses. Like it's real like hard science that is now integrated to with like every piece of technology that we use today and take for granted. Especially in America, like the phones that we've got in our pocket every day are enabled through space and investments in space technology. But the United States government did plant a lot of like the seed funding for the basic science and technology that have kind of enabled a lot of these technologies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the U.S. government funded seed funded Silicon Valley before Silicon Valley got started, and is really a big reason why Silicon Valley is what it is today. But then private industry and the U.S. free market economy takes a hold and really churns it into this behemoth. And that's
Mm-hmm.
really the advantage of what the U.S. is. It's like our free market enables this rapid technological development and sustainability because we create whole new economies centered around these technologies that sustain themselves and kick off further developments in technology. And that's really what helped win the Cold War, is that we had this sustainable technological advancement and economic development, and that, as opposed to the Soviet Union's like centrally controlled, directed monetary policy and investment policy that they were trying to pick. The government was centrally trying to pick winners and losers, and they just weren't efficient enough. Like the free market economy in the United States, just like by its nature, like the best ideas rise to the top.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, all that to say, I could go off on a bunch of tangents, but
No, I'm excited. You gave me a new discussion topic for my class, which is what are the takeaways from the investments in space exploration itself have benefited us in more ways than just space exploration. So that's going to be a really fun topic to dig into and to
yeah,
just bring awareness and appreciation to it. I mean, I'm a big fan of space exploration, but I'm sure I've overlooked like what you just said, the variety of ways that those technologies have contributed to our lives in our day to day that we just don't realize. Okay, one other question about satellite assets and all the things um, that you guys are monitoring, apart from international things that we've talked about. What about phenomenon like solar storms or monitoring asteroids or planetary defense? Does that fall in your plate too?
this is a great question, and we just talked about this. And so I'm currently in another graduate program full time for the Space Force. When you're like a major, between major and lieutenant colonel, they send you to this intermediate leadership school, and I'm at Johns Hopkins right now
Oh,
studying space
nice.
security. Um,
Is that kind
and
of like the War College in Newport, Rhode Island for the Navy?
yeah,
Like it's a
yeah,
similar, okay,
exactly.
leadership
Yep.
program.
Yep, exactly right. So the Navy does it in Newport, Rhode Island
Hmm.
at their Naval War College, and the Space Force just stood up their own school, which is a partnership program with Johns Hopkins University.
Nice.
So
Congratulations.
thank you. Yeah, I've been there. I'm about to graduate in like a week, so I'm excited.
Oh, that's a huge deal.
But to answer your question, space weather, yes, the Space Force. Not only do we have ground-based sensors and space-based sensors that are looking at each other.
Hmm.
Ground-based sensors looking up at space. We've got space-based sensors looking back at Earth, but we also have space-based sensors and ground sensors looking into deep space.
Okay.
And we are monitoring space weather because space weather impacts satellite
Hmm.
orbits and orbital mechanics. It all factors in when we're operating. The Space Force operates and sustains all the DoD satellites orbiting Earth. Well, Space Command does, but um, space weather plays a huge impact into maintaining our orbits and things like that. So yeah, we have to monitor space weather. And then the second question was planetary defense, and this just came up, whose job that was,
Okay.
uh, because
We got to have somebody on
traditionally,
it.
yeah, the Space Force, or previously Air Force Space Command, has historically been more focused on supporting the joint fight, supporting using space assets to support the Army and the Navy and the Air Force.
Hmm.
But now that we're starting to focus more on space, defending space in space, because there's
Hmm.
threats into the space domain. Um, we're also starting to think more about space planetary defense. And you guys are probably familiar with the NASA DART mission and kind of the initial like science S&T exploration mission that they did.
And
So I
that's
think
that's that's for defense against like asteroids and impacts.
that's right. Yep.
Okay.
So NASA sent a rocket basically to go impact an asteroid that wasn't on a collision course to Earth,
Right.
but was coming near Earth to see how they could, whether they could be successful in like,
Changing
um,
its trajectory.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so this has been a long way to answer your question, but I believe that U.S. Space Command has a memorandum signed that they will play an active role in planetary defense in conjunction with NASA and likely the United Nations. So the UN COPUOS, UN Committee of the Peace for the Peaceful Use of Outer Space,
Oh,
I believe will also play. I mean, obviously it'll be a global event
yeah.
if
It's
something like
it's
that
like who's
happens.
on
So
shift that day, right?
yeah, I'm sure it'll be hopefully international like collaboration to save the Earth.
Yeah. Okay, well that's good. That's I haven't felt threatened and now I definitely don't because we've got everybody keeping an eye on it. And I wrote down to look up, you said UN copious.
Yeah, COPUOS is I believe it's the UN Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space.
That's cool. I'm excited to
Yeah,
look that up.
and they've got some other things that you should read from the UN probably are the Outer Space Treaty and the Moon. I think it's called the Moon Treaty. I should know that. But those treaties talk about the current international law or policies associated with using about surrounding sovereignty in space. So the Moon Treaty, for instance, says that no nation can claim sovereignty over celestial over the moon specifically.
Hmm.
So if China, the United States lands on the moon again and we establish a lunar base, that treaty says that's not Chinese or United States sovereign territory. Uh,
Everybody's welcome.
Everyone's welcome. No one has a claim to it. In fact, it goes further to say that other nations, you're not allowed to have military installations on the moon. And other nations have the right to come inspect your facilities on the moon to make sure that they're not being militarized and things like that.
That's a lot of foresight involved there,
Well, yeah, it was
considering.
signed in, I believe, 1967, but the
Wow.
United States is not a signatory to that treaty. So,
Wow.
yeah, there's a lot of interesting discussions your class could have about why wouldn't the United States sign something like that? Why wouldn't we be interested in signing the outer space or the Moon Treaty? It's not called the Moon Treaty. It's gonna bug me, but the Outer Space Treaty definitely is the U.S. is a signatory on that, and it talks about how um, space resources are for uh, like the benefit of humanity.
Hmm.
So that's kind of like it's almost like Marxist, like socialist ideology that kind of prohibits individual nation states from going and collecting resources for their own profit. Like anything collected from space, the profits would have to be shared amongst the international community. And so now there's a lot of debates about like what does that mean? Like what sort of profit sharing should be implemented? Um, the United States just passed, not just, but the White House sent out a space policy directive that kind of flies in the face of that international law, which states that the United States will support privatization of to utilize commercial space um, resources, and that commercial entities or private entities do have a right to collect profits from harvesting space resources. So we talk about like asteroid mining and things like that, and the potential profits with that could come with that. Um, the United States anyway, the White House has indicated that we're going to be supportive of private entities like going out and doing that, which
Hmm.
obviously lowers the risk and incentivizes private industry to pursue those types of activities.
Hmm. And then maybe there's an opportunity for shared technologies by supporting that too.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And again, that the DoD and Space Force commercial integration policies that we just put out, and then the space policy directives that the White House puts out occasionally and the national space policy all talk about this, like how essential it is for US national space power to integrate with private space, commercial space, and partner and allied nations, um, to invest, in the things that enable space, like the basic science and technology, um, to, supporting, providing the seed funds and de-risking commercial activity to promote, the private actions in space and things like that. Because we see, as I mentioned previously, like the US free market economy being like our decisive advantage in the current space race. And
Hmm.
so how can we lower the barriers of privatization and commercialization of space for the US's advantage?
There's I've learned so much today about how much goes on um behind the scenes, because I know that most people are only familiar with the clips of launches or the clips of Doug and Bob going to the International Space Station a few years ago. Like we only get to
Yep.
see the really pretty, interesting parts. And there is so much thought, and I'm sure debate that is happening right now and will continue to happen because we've got, huge goals for space exploration. So if you don't mind, to wrap us up, can I do like a rapid fire question? Like this is, I know this is your opinion, so this will
Yeah.
be, I think this will be a lot of fun. But to wrap us up, so based on all of your experience with the Air Force, SpaceX, Space Force, and then what you know about everything going on in the world, these are your opinions. So,
Okay.
okay,
Yep.
let's start with something easy. What was your favorite experience at SpaceX?
Well, so I was on console for the Bob and Doug launch. That was pretty
Okay,
cool.
I like that one.
But we called it the Space Force Launch Commander for the GPS 3.5 and GPS 3.6 satellite launches. So
Okay.
the DoD launches were had a little bit more meaning for us because those were our missions, and
Hmm.
so probably being like the team leader for the launch of those two GPS launches, which there's a lot of reasons. You can go Google why GPS 3.5 and GPS 3.6 were important missions for the Space Force and for the U.S. military, but probably being in charge of those missions was probably my most significant accomplishment.
That's awesome. And you're in the room, right? You're in the launch room when that stuff is happening.
Yeah, and there's a couple different launch rooms. So you see
Yeah.
it on TV or whatever. There's like one launch room and everybody's in there.
Yeah.
But the Space Force has their launch room and we're monitored. So the Space Force, sorry, not to, I know this is supposed to be rapid fire,
No,
but,
it's good. I like this info.
and I've got tons of time, so I can go as
Okay,
long as you want.
good.
But
Good.
the Space Force at the Cape, we own the launch site. So, and we provide all the commodities and infrastructure to the launch service providers. We provide that to SpaceX, and then SpaceX leases the ground and
Hmm.
builds their own launch site capability, and we provide them the rocket fuel and the oxygen and the nitrogen and the hydrogen
Hmm.
and whatever they need, and the electricity, and then we are also responsible for the public safety mission, so
Hmm.
certifying SpaceX or United Launch Alliance or Blue Origin's launches to make sure that the public are going to be safe. So we make sure that they're not going to launch over land or over across a town, or that it's not going to blow up, or if something does go wrong, they have a means to like destroy the rocket without hurting people. We
Yeah.
also work with the FAA and the Coast Guard to make sure the air and the sea lanes are clear on launch day. And then we sit on console to make sure that the satellite and we work with SpaceX and the other launch service providers. The whole time they're building the rocket on the ground and integrating the satellite to the rocket, and then through all the testing and procedures to make sure that the mission has the highest chance of success. And then we sit on console and monitor all the same systems that SpaceX is monitoring to make sure nothing on the ground side, the launch site infrastructure side, or the rocket or the satellite itself in the fairing, like that all of that is looking green. And then
Hmm.
we make sure the public safety aspect looks good, the air and sea lanes are clear, and the weather looks good. And then we give the go for launch. So um, anyway,
That's
sitting
cool.
on
We went to Cocoa Beach and I think it was 2021. I think we were there. Maybe it was 2022 and got to see a launch and then got to see the booster land as well. And I saw the Coast Guard helicopter come by a couple of times. And my thought was that the Coast Guard was there to protect the launch. So making sure there's nobody crazy trying to do anything on launch day on the beach, like no
Yeah,
distractions.
they could have been. Typically, we work with the FAA, and the FAA puts out what they call a NOTAM, which is like no aircraft are allowed, a no-fly zone basically around
Yeah,
the launch site. And if anyone violates that airspace when a NOTAM's been issued, they can lose their aviation, they can lose their flying license and things like
yeah.
that. So that's typically the FAA's mission is to control the airspace, but the ground or but the sea lanes, the Coast Guard's out there with ships telling
Hmm.
people to go. If they're not answering the radio, they'll drive up alongside their boat and say, get out of
Get
here,
out of here. Yeah.
or send a helicopter to do that. And then we also, for manned launches like Bob and Doug or like the NASA launches to the ISS, um, our Air Force pararescue helicopters are also flying around on standby. So in case the launch goes wrong or during reentry, and the astronauts get ejected and or land into the water,
Hmm.
our Air Force pararescue go out and like get them and save
Yeah.
them. So
Yeah.
it's like launch day is crazy, and there's a ton of things going on. Lots of law enforcement, like protecting the launch site and the public. And the launch rate, and you guys have probably talked about this a little bit, but the launch rates over the last 10 years, 15 years have grown exponentially.
It's crazy. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
It used
We,
to be, I mean, after the shuttle program ended in 2012,
mhm.
we weren't launching anything to the International Space Station.
Right.
And the number of satellites we were launching were like 10, 12 launches a year.
Right. Super
This
quiet.
year, this year the United States is going to launch over 100.
Hmm.
And so that exponential growth has driven, I mean, it was very cool living on the Space Coast or on Cocoa Beach
Hmm.
and just seeing how much investment in the space launch industry was coming. How many new jobs? Thousands of
Yeah.
jobs, billions of dollars of investment in space launch. Um, so I am biased to the space launch industry, but the space is much bigger than just launch. But it is,
Yeah.
to your point, like the most publicly visible aspect of what we do.
Yeah, I was so surprised because I think there were that at that time of the year there was like two per week scheduled, and then you've got your weather days just in case. And I
Yep.
was so thankful that it was a good day. And we went out to eat after we saw it, and I asked the waitress because we were right there on the dock, and I was like, "Isn't this amazing that you get to work here and see that?" Like every time she was, "Oh, I know it's so loud every time," and I'm like, "Do you know how big of a deal this is?" So they're used to it. It's
Yeah, I
happening so
mean, my
much.
neighborhood, the house that we had was in a neighborhood of people that had mostly been living there for like 30 years, and
Yeah.
people still got excited about every launch, even though we had 60, 70 launches that year. Everybody would still, when it was in the middle of the day, of course, people would
Yeah.
still go out in the street and watch the launches. And
Or like 2
um,
a.m. they're waking up to it
yeah,
sometimes.
because it's rattling your windows. But
And I'm sure Falcon Heavy, if you were used to launches, when Falcon Heavy showed up, that changed the game a little bit too.
yeah,
A little
Falcon
bit
Heavy. I
bigger.
mean, Delta 4, the Delta Heavy missions were pretty big. Of course, back in the day, um, the space shuttle launches were also really loud, and then
Hmm.
Apollo before that. But um, yeah, Falcon Heavy's loud. Starship is gonna be really
Really
loud.
loud. Yeah.
The Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket is gonna be big and loud. So
I
yeah.
know. I wrote down Blue Origin. I need to look into that. That's another company.
Yeah, Blue Origin is Jeff Bezos's
Oh, okay.
company.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're probably familiar with New Shepard, which is their small launch vehicle that like Jeff Bezos went up
Hmm.
in, and it's really just for space tourism.
Hmm.
But New Glenn is like a Starship class or Artemis class rocket that's like really big. It'll have some reusable parts. And Jeff Bezos, well, Amazon or Blue Origin is planning to compete with SpaceX's Starlink system, which is
Hmm.
their proliferated low Earth orbit communication satellite, like
Hmm.
thousands of satellites. Blue Origin will have their own kind of equivalent system called Kuiper that they're planning to start launching out of the Cape. within the next couple years.
Yeah, you're gonna have some traffic. There's gonna be some traffic to
Yeah,
monitor.
and then Vulcan, the United Launch Alliance, they just flew out their last Delta rocket. So Delta will no longer fly. They still have the Atlas V rocket, but they just brought on a new rocket called Vulcan, and Vulcan will kind of be their rocket for the future. So Vulcan's gonna be launching like dozens of times a year. I don't know how many launches they have planned right now, but um, yeah.
There's a
And then
lot of opportunity then for anyone to go through NASA, Space Force, SpaceX. Now you've got Blue Origin. You've got so many
yeah, and
opportunities to get involved with it.
those are just the launch service
Hmm.
providing companies. There's also just a huge boom in satellite manufacturing, um, data analytics. When we talk about space systems, we talk about kind of a triad, the ground system, the space system, and then the link between the ground and space system. And um, the link is, electromagnetic frequency. So you need people that know about that stuff. You need to know people on the cybersecurity side that can
Hmm.
protect that data link. And then you need people on the ground side building ground infrastructure to support not just launch, but also space operations. And then you need people savvy in space operations and orbital mechanics and all those things to design and build and operate space-based systems. So there's just like I said earlier at the very beginning of the call, like if no matter what field you're interested in, there's likely a space application for it. So it's
Yeah,
not just limited to, astrophysics or
right.
whatever.
Right. And I always found the public affairs roles interesting. There was a time when I was kind of keeping an eye on different opportunities, and I was like, man, it'd be fun to be the person who explains it to the public, like who
Yeah.
gets up and translates it. Like, I think that would just be so much fun.
Yeah.
Um,
And those roles really are essential. And, I talked earlier about how space operations has been so kind of like secret in the past.
mhm.
Um, but we're really starting to see the aperture open a little bit, and the Space Force's marketing campaigns are out there. I mean, I think they had some on the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Like their websites are pretty good. Like they're trying to like it's essential for us to create an interest in STEM, of course, but space in general for
Mhm.
younger generations that want to get involved and inspired by space to enter the field. So that's why I enjoy doing things like this and, talking to students and uh you
Another
know
rapid fire question for you.
yeah,
Will people go to Mars?
yeah,
Yeah.
people go to Mars. I mean, I think the limiting factor for going to Mars will be will,
Right.
whether that's the political will of um the Artemis mission to continue to keep that funded.
Hmm.
But I think there's so much like momentum with private industry that I think private industry, at least in the United States, will go there regardless of political will. So SpaceX, just one example, SpaceX is going to be self-sustaining,
Hmm.
once their Starlink operating model becomes sufficiently profitable, like they'll be able to sustain their like all the costs of going to Mars on their own if they want. And I think,
That's amazing.
yeah, that was kind of the whole intent of Starship was to be this funding vehicle, not only provide, basically space-based internet capability to the world and communications capabilities to the world, especially like to places like Africa and South America,
Yeah.
but to also self-fund itself to Mars and beyond. So,
To do the
uh,
extra fun stuff.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, if they
But,
could guarantee that we'd come back, then I think I'd be interested in the trip out. I just don't know right now if the intention is to get out and stay or if we're going out and coming back yet.
well,
So-
and that's I was talking about sustainability previously. I think the reason if you like study Apollo and all the Apollo program, obviously we went to the moon
Mhm.
a couple times and we came
Mhm.
back and then we stopped going to the moon.
Mhm.
And why is that? I think, and not to go too deep into it, but we were in the midst of this geopolitical back and forth between the United States and the Soviet Union. We decisively won the Cold War, and then there was really no more political will to continue to go back to the moon to show the Soviets that we, dominated them or whatever.
Yeah.
But there was no sustainability in that because it wasn't tied to any private economic model for
Mm-hmm.
sustained growth and profitability, which is what the whole US free market economy is based off of. So I
Mm-hmm.
think this new space race is more sustainable in that it is being driven by the commercial space sector. And so, if you see Elon or Jeff Bezos or whoever like finding a profit reason, profit motives to go to Mars, um, that's independent of the political will of the U.S. government to fund those things, that's going to be a more sustainable model than Apollo was, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, we talk about that too. You know, they say, well, if it was, we talk about the conspiracies behind landing on the moon, and one of the arguments is, well, if we can get there, why aren't we still going there? And we talk about that in detail. Well, here's a couple of reasons why. Here were the motivations. Here's where the motivation dropped off. Here's where the cost versus benefit dropped off, and then we got some rocks, and we were happy with those rocks for now. So we talked.
I'll give you like another reason why it's more interesting now for us to go back to the moon. So with some of the um, Earth or the moon like reconnaissance missions that NASA has put out,
Hmm.
and that is in the spectroscopy that's been accomplished
Hmm.
to find water on specifically the polar regions of the moon. Like using the moon, the gravity. If you want to go into astrophysics or just physics in general, like the gravity well of the moon is much um, less than the gravity well of the Earth. So it takes a lot less energy to, launch a rocket from the moon than it does from
Right.
the Earth. And if we can harvest water ice from the moon and through electrolysis or whatever means to convert that into rocket fuel, basically hydrogen and oxygen, we can use the moon as a staging ground um, to launch from to sustain satellites in space or to launch satellites in space. So, um, if you put a couple like autonomous robots on the moon that can launch back and forth to sustain satellite operations in low, medium, or uh, Earth orbit, or a geosynchronous orbit, like it would be a much more sustainable cost model to have that service based off the moon than the Earth, just based on that like gravity well perspective. And then using the moon as like a launching point for deep space missions um, is an exciting opportunity. I think that like either private industry or government entities would be interested in pursuing.
You just gave me a lot to think about. I hadn't thought about those parts yet. That's awesome. Um did you ever get to meet Elon Musk?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would be on calls with them, like launch readiness reviews and post flight. It'd always be interesting after a launch attempt, like if there was a scrub due for whatever
Hmm.
reason to a technical issue from SpaceX, like Elon would get on the phone quite often and like yell at his team about how unacceptable it was for them to scrub launches. And it was always really interesting to hear how hard he was on his team.
Yeah.
But
I've
yeah,
heard
I
stories like that before.
yeah, yeah. He's
Yeah.
definitely a hard he expects a lot from his
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, how about Neil deGrasse Tyson? Have you met Neil deGrasse Tyson?
I have not met Neil deGrasse Tyson. We were supposed to bring him in to speak to my current like school group,
Hmm.
but for some reason we couldn't get a hold of him. But I have met Michio Kaku, if you're
Okay.
familiar with him, astrophysicist. Um,
I enjoy him on all the documentaries,
yeah,
all of
yeah,
them.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I mean, I've met some like astronauts and stuff, but
Yeah.
I mean, there's not a whole lot of like space rock stars, you know.
Yeah, it sounds like
But
you've met most of them
well,
though.
I mean, I haven't met like Jeff Bezos or Richard Branson or any of those guys that are also kind of leading the space efforts. But our through our school program, we were able to go to a National Space Council um, meeting that's chaired by Kamala Harris, the Vice President Kamala
Hmm.
Harris, and a lot of the leading kind of policy folks on space matters for the United States government. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that is cool. And what's a personal goal of yours or a professional goal now that you are where you are in your career? I mean, what's the next big thing for you? Because it sounds like you are incredibly accomplished in this field already. So what's next for you?
So next for me after school is I'll be at the Pentagon and I'm gonna go be what's called a program element monitor. So um, it's kind of complicated, but essentially every large DoD program has someone in the Pentagon who's kind of a subject matter expert for that program. And then they monitor the execution of that program and the budget of that program. And then anytime anyone in the Department of Defense or the Department of the Air Force or Space Force, like bigwig leadership, like the four-star
Hmm.
generals and stuff, or if anyone from the White House or Capitol Hill have questions on that program, like I would be the liaison to the general officer who's running that program to all those like leadership folks. And
Okay.
so I'm going to go be the program element monitor for the National Security Space Launch Mission, which is space launch
Hmm.
for the Space Force. So I'm going to go be kind of the subject matter expert for space launch for the Space Force in the Pentagon.